Okay.
Hi, so thank you all for coming. We're sorry for being a little bit late. Our talk today, Crowdsourcing in Architecture by Kuba Snopek, will be introduced by Joanna, who is a junior fellow in King's College.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you everyone for coming. I will keep it short so that we could go straight to the matter. Kuba is a good friend of mine who's an architect, urban planner, and a researcher, and he approaches the topics of urbanism and public space and architectural process, I think, from many different access points that are interesting. He has worked as an architect for Belyayevo group for several years. Then he wrote a book on Soviet mass housing and the collective dimension of socialist and post-socialist architecture and post-socialist cities. He was active in the Strelka Institute in Moscow with Rem Koolhaas, where he co-developed experimental programs in architectural education, and I know that he considers himself very much as a pedagogue of architecture as an important thing. And right now he's also a curator of educational program at Kharkiv School of Architecture in Ukraine, which is technically the first school of architecture in Ukraine. So it's also like a project that's gaining a lot of speed now. And he's been interested for many years in the collective dimension of architecture, and one of his big projects also that he co-curated was called Architecture of the Seventh Day. It's on the process of building churches in Poland, in socialist Poland in the 80s, where the building of the churches was allowed by the state, but not facilitated by the state, and therefore neither financially nor organizationally, and therefore it became very much a grassroots, bottom-up project, also in terms of design, where the whole community came together to design a church. And he will surely talk about it as well today. So thanks for coming, anyway, and enjoy the talk.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me here to Cambridge. I will put a timer so that I know how much I'm speaking. Sorry. Stopwatch. So as Joanna said, I'm very strongly interested in architecture in the collective, and I consider myself a researcher doing an applied research, meaning a research that is leading to a better understanding of the process of design, better understanding of the process of building, and better architecture at the end. And of course I come from Eastern Europe, so my imagination about what architecture is and what it can be, it was shaped very much about the ideas of the Russian avant-garde from 100 years ago, where the idea of the collective was very strongly accented and put emphasis on. So for example, all of us probably know the image of this building, which is a collective, a house, a club for workers where they could do something together after work. Probably many of you know these kind of communal houses that were designed 100 years ago, where the architects were trying to redesign the everyday life of the people, of the Soviet people, and give them an opportunity to divide their life between what they do individually and what they do collectively. And of course there was a lot of collective action. Probably some of you know these kind of theatrical spectacles that were designed just after the October Revolution, where the mass theater came into the streets, and then there are these designs of the whole plazas that were designed as theaters, as huge stages where the people would go and do something collectively. So what's really interesting about this, that on the one hand, the avant-garde that was there 100 years ago, it put a great emphasis on the collective action. On the other hand, there was like one area of this collective that was excluded from this collective action, and this is precisely what I'm interested in, the architectural design. So if you look at how the architects were designing, they were sole authors, creators of space. There were some collectives in the very beginning, but at the end, it was the architect that was designing something alone and giving the form to the people so that the people can collectively live. And I think that it's extremely important to review this idea today, because this architecture, it appeared 100 years ago because of huge technological and societal changes. And I think that today there's another wave of these huge changes, and I believe that the essence of them is communication. And the essence of them is communication that's reciprocal, that is instant, that is free, and that allows for much more collective action. There are a lot of architects today who are trying to rethink architecture, and they talk about the computational power that we have that we didn't have. They talk about the technology, smart cities, but I believe that these are of secondary importance, and my personal project and something that I'm interested in is about possibilities that communication unlimited communication gives to architectural design. So today I will speak for half an hour, and the presentation will be divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I will give some overview of the context of Eastern European architecture in the second part of the 20th century. I was asked by Joanna to give some sort of introduction of what was actually built in Eastern Europe in the last 50 years. In the second part, I will give you an example. I will show you a precedent of collectively made and collectively designed and built architecture that I think is quite important, that inspires me. And in the third part, I will show you a prototype of something that we built based on the knowledge that was found. So I have to start with Khrushchev. I made quite a big research of Khrushchev-era architecture, about preservation of Khrushchevian architecture. And I consider Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, as the most important architect of Eastern Europe. Although he was, of course, not an architect. Why do I say so? Because like he came, sorry, there's something wrong with this. He came to power after Joseph Stalin, and he inherited a huge problem. He inherited a housing problem. You can see how many square meters of housing were available for a citizen throughout the Stalin period. And it was on the verge, on the edge of a revolution. The people started rebelling about like how little housing they have, how little square meters they have, and something had to be done. Moreover, as you know, the times of Stalin were the times of Gulag, and during the thaw, around 2 million people were freed from the Gulag, and they also had nowhere to live, so something had to be done. And Khrushchev decided very quickly after he came to power, he decided to revolutionize architecture and make it totally industrially made. And as you can see, it actually worked. Like the crisis of housing was overcome very quickly. So what actually happened? In 1954, in December, Nikita Khrushchev made a speech where he actually laid out his program of architecture. And this speech has a very long and boring name. I call it Khrushchev's manifesto because of that. It's easier. And what did Khrushchev say? He said, first, we have to industrialize construction. So the idea was that the houses will be made in the factories, and this kind of factories were built. They are still operating. Many of them, this is the so-called DSK-3 in Moscow that I visited a few years ago. It was opened in 1964. Second of all, the parts. Buildings were manufactured in parts, and the parts were manufactured in the plant construction industry, and that made a huge difference for architecture. This is probably the most epic example of what followed this, or consequences, the so-called K7. This is a building that was built of not more than 2 dozens of different parts, only 2 dozens of different parts that were assembled during 24 hours, and it could house 60 families. So extreme simplicity. Then he said that the number of designs has to be limited to standard designs. So what followed were so-called series of houses, and these series of houses were produced. They're quite different. They are different in different climatic zones, in different countries, but still the houses were produced by series. I really like this small detail. Another consequence of this, a small detail of the housing estate that I was researching, that you can see that the architects very often were following this idea of prefabricating and copying and making series, so that you have these groups of houses that were actually put in a very similar way. So one of the artists that I was, with whom I was working, he noticed this funny thing that there are many people in here that have the same prefabricated view from the window. So you can see that quite a generic landscape has been created. Another very important thing is that the offices, the architectural offices were consolidated. Huge institutes were created that were designing new microrayons, housing estates. And the consequence of that is creation of a different kind of an architect. So on this photo, which I really like, you can see Nikita Khrushchev, some random military guy, and Yakov Belyayevo, an architect who in his life built 140 million square meters of housing, which I checked today is 1.5 billion square feet, which is a lot. So this kind of architect was created that was almost a god, that was operating on such a huge territory and a huge scale. But on the other hand, this architect was limited from the other side. He would not really design houses, only very specific buildings. And in general, he was operating on this kind of huge scale of designing the whole neighborhood and being this kind of a scientist that is designing the trajectories of movement of people. And maybe a funny element, what also Khrushchev said, he's not against beauty but against unnecessary elements. So architecture became very, very simple and honest, we could say, boxy. And in different communist countries, there were different details. There were, of course, different leaders with different ambitions, and many elements were different, but the general idea of having a prefabricated landscape, it was very much the same. So what I would say, I would borrow the word ecosystem from the world of business, like economic system. Khrushchev designed this kind of ecosystem, how everything was working. What was the location of all these cogs in this huge production machine. And the thing is, now I'm coming to the second part of my presentation, the thing is that one country where it didn't work that way, maybe in different Eastern European countries there were different details, but one country where it was very, very different was Poland, because there was this architecture that in details was different from the Soviet one, but in a general scheme it was more or less the same. And on the other hand, there was a completely different kind of architecture, which I would say was based on efficient communication. This one was based on efficient industrial production, this one on efficient communication. So again, a little bit of historical context. This is a map that explains, I think, everything. This is the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union, and the red or the orange is the amount of Catholics in population. So you can see that Poland is a country where two worldviews and two ideological systems and two value systems actually overlap. So if you go back to this, in architecture, it's reflected like this. On the map, it's reflected like this. There are actually two competing systems of values. And after communism was brought to Poland in 1945-47, for a few years there was a very forceful introduction of the system until 1956, when the Stalinist period ended, so about a decade. And the communists actually failed to do two things. First, they failed to destroy the institutional church, so this kind of alternative actually state. And the second important thing is about property. They were not able to nationalize property in the rural areas, which actually had great consequences that I will share. So if we take, for example, the design of the perfect Stalinist city, Nowa Huta, next to Krakow, and if we take the realization, it was realized almost as it was designed, right? You can see that the housing is where it should be, but there is one detail, that all the public buildings that were designed, they are not there, but instead of them, there are churches that are hiding in different places. Let's look at this into detail. First important thing is what Joanna told about before. It's very weird relation between the church and the government in the communist era. At first, the government wanted to simply forbid building churches. And they did that in 1960. There was a small church being built in Nowa Huta, exactly in that neighborhood that I showed. And the government forbid this, and huge riots started. They took about a week. 400 people were injured, as I remember. Maybe this is the wrong number, but in general, it was something very frightening. And from this moment on, the relation is like, it's not really allowed to build churches, but it's also not prohibited. Some permits are being given, but not so many. It's very much like this situation where it's not really, it's in a gray zone. So one example how it worked. For example, this is the church in Tychy, built in the 1950s, 1960s during the Khrushchev thaw. The city of Tychy was one of the biggest communist projects to design the city anew. And as I said, the land belonged to the private proprietors, and they chipped in, they created a new plot of land, they built a church, and only afterwards the city came and the church was already there. So there are like many different ways how it could have been done, but in general the churches were trying to sneak into the space of the city. Now, an important infographic in here, let's look at the left side, the right side is not important. This is the amount, the number of churches that are being built, and this is time. So here's 1945, the end of the war. Here is the death of Stalin. Here, John Paul II is the Pole is being elected the Pope, and there are solidarity strikes, a huge uprising of the working class. And you can see that the churches that are being built, they actually follow this kind of political situation. If there is a political instability, the churches are being built. A small group of them after the death of Stalin, and a big group of them after Solidarity. This is actually something that I call the architecture of Solidarity. Solidarity was a movement where the workers made an alliance with the church and intelligentsia against the government, the communist government, and this architecture was a product of that. So what happens after 1980? A lot of churches are being built, and they are built outside of the system that Khrushchev created. They are, I would say, architecturally sophisticated, big, complex, very diverse, and there's really many of them. There's like, actually there is 3,800. We can calculate that we counted them. Some of them were built legally, some of them were built with the permits, some of them were built illegally, but they were always built outside of the state construction system. So if we take a look at the architects, in the communist times it was not allowed to have a private office, but many architects are working in the nights in their house designing the churches, and during the day in the offices designing housing, industry, whatever is needed. If we look, sorry, there's something really wrong about this. If we look at the construction side, there are no machines that are available. The state doesn't allow the builders to build the machines, to use the machines. There are no building materials, there are no professionals, so there is just a local parish, the people who come together and they just build. If we look at the machinery, wheelbarrows and other things of that size that are being coordinated on the construction side, and the priest who, let's say, has a position of a developer and an architect, they are working together and they are discussing it and trying to build it. And now, this is part of a big research that I co-authored together with my colleagues Isabella and Karolina Popera. We made a big work discussing this with the architects, actually interviewing them. And each of these architects said, look, this was medieval times. We were building like in medieval times. It was, and they were using this word medieval all the time, and they were a little bit ashamed of that, but what we saw is that they were actually extremely successful, because having no access to any materials and machinery and big offices and whatever, they were able to build something incredible. So we tried to actually understand how this system works. And I would say a very simplified diagram that I drew to just explain this is that it was very much based in communication. So there was an architect who created some sort of a vision, together with the priest, the parish priest that wanted to build something. So they created some sort of a general vision of what should be built. And then they started building this, and there were shortages. There were shortages of material, shortages of I don't know, building elements, shortages of labor, money. So every week the priest would go to the pulpit, like here, and after the mass he would say, look, we're building a church, we need this, we need that, we need this, we need that, and then people would come and would simply deliver. So you could say that it was happening every week, and the parish community was simply delivering the resources, labor, skill, talent to the architect. So you could actually change the names, and you say that an architect was using a very efficient medium, and instead of using the word parish, you would use the word audience, like we normally do with this is the naming you use in, let's say, internet times. And my theory is, or my hypothesis here is that this architecture was based on crowdsourcing. What is crowdsourcing? Crowdsourcing is a model of production in the age of internet. The name was coined, or the term was coined in 2006, so it didn't exist back then. It was proto-crowdsourcing. But the point is that in crowdsourcing, there's an institution that creates some sort of a vision and then tries to get resources, labor from people, and people try to participate in that. It's very different from, for example, I don't know, the models like Wikipedia, where you don't have the vision. You don't know what's going to be at the end. Like everybody is doing something, but there's just a way of, the modus operandi, the way of adding things, but you don't have the final vision. In crowdsourcing, you have the final vision, and everybody is participating in that and altering it a little bit. So you could say that this kind of crowdsourced architecture model would look like this. There's an architect, there's an audience, and there's a constant communication between them. So let's look how it looked in the practice. I will just give you a few examples. So example number one, this church in Krakow, it needed some material for the facade. So there was this open call for the people to bring stones from the river and from vacation. For the facade, the people brought 4 million stones, and architect put them on the facade. The same thing with this crown. It was like rings and necklaces and other golden elements were collected in order to create this golden crown on the very top. So you can see that in this case, there's this situation where the movement, on the one hand, the architect is asking for something, and then the people are bringing it, and the architect is using this. But there's also like more complicated situations. If we look at this church, for example, in Wrocław, the same thing happened with bricks, right? There was like a lack of bricks. You can see it. You can see it there. That somebody brought bricks, then somebody else brought bricks, and somebody else brought bricks, and this is the amount of bricks that probably can fit into the car or something like this. So it's the same situation like with the stones, that you can read this story of construction from the facade, which annoys the architects. I find it very beautiful. But there's another thing, like this Rosetta. It was more of a dialogue between the parish and the architect, right? The architect wanted to have something here, but then there was a community of old stonemasons that happened to live in this parish, and they knew how to do it, and they decided to help the architect, and they created something that was, let's say, unexpected. And there are many details in this church that were created like this, which sounds like a very small, let's say, detail, but I think it completely alters the model, because this is an architecture where there is dialogue, and there is ideas that are coming from the audience, and the audience is not merely like a resource, but it's also like co-created. So the question is it possible to control it? Is it possible to design this way? And I would say that this finding, we started treating this whole, this collection of 3,800 churches as some sort of a laboratory of crowdsourced architecture, and we started asking questions. And I'm going to share 4 questions of the huge list of questions that we had that we were asking. So for example, the question about collective form. We are typically thinking of architecture as one gesture. There is a gesture of an architect, which is singular. It's synthetic, meaning that architecture is a synthetic form that's much more than simply a sum of elements. On the other hand, if we are designing collectively, we are talking more about mosaic, where it's not synthetic, it's more like coherence that comes from diversity. Is it even possible to do it? How do you do that? Well, in practice, it was not like the architect was taking any ideas. It was more like the architect was looking at the audience, at the parish, and trying to figure out what kind of talent there is and what kind of resources there are, and trying to create collaborations. So for example, this is a church in an extremely small town of Rybin. Do you know the town of Rybin? No, it's like really small. And the architect understood that in the parish there are artists that are working with stained glass. And he decided, okay, this is the resource that we have. My church will simply be a framework, and we will just build the biggest possible stained glass art in Poland. And this is what they did. Another example is the architects that understood that in the parish they have a team of mathematicians. So what can you do with a team of mathematicians? Of course, you can create this kind of hyper, this kind of shell, which is very difficult to create if you don't have a mathematician on board, but if you do, it's actually possible. So, shortly speaking, this collective form was successful in these churches whenever there was a decision to actually be very conscious about it and like bring on board different collaborations that will alter the form. Another question, of course, is who is the author? Authorship is an extremely important thing in architecture. Many people like build architecture just to be authors. So what are the possibilities? There's a very interesting example. The architect Halina Skibniewska was asked by parishioners to build a church. Instead of building one, she found one that was devastated, a Baroque church, and she organized this kind of crowdsourced process of like moving the church from one village to another and creating value for everyone, creating this kind of valuable, beautiful space, but without really being the author of the church. So she resigned from authorship. She built a school instead. So it was also possible. But in general, the idea of authorship is something that has to be dealt with, and everything has to be very precise and clear. Who did what and who is the author of what. The other question is the question of expertise, and this is something that is, I think, very important today because we have all these movements, this movement of the activists and urbanists who know better how the city should be designed. I will show you 3 examples of what happened. So, like one extreme example is a church that was designed in Krakow in 1979 or 1978, just after Karol Wojtyła, the bishop of Krakow, was elected a pope. And the architect went to him to talk with him for an hour and convince him that this is what the church should do. Instead of looking backwards, we should go forward and create this kind of extremely sophisticated form that's made of concrete. It's quite difficult. And then the Pope accepted this and used his authority to tell the people of Krakow that this is the right thing to do. And according to what the architect told us, this kind of authoritarian way of including the people worked pretty well, and everybody participated as they could. On the other hand, there's something that I would call, quotation marks, populist, right? In the 1990s, when the church builders were already well aware of how this construction is working, they decided to build the biggest church for pilgrims in Europe. This is the 3rd biggest Catholic temple in the world, and it was all built from donations. It's like totally 100% crowdfunded. And of course, the form of this, it must have been extremely simple and understandable and legible for everyone in order to be successful as crowdfunding. Another example which I find the right, let's say, middle way is an architect who is, on the one hand, creating space, and he is trying to use his expertise to create beautiful space, use light, and do the architectural work. On the other hand, he's always open on different collaborations, and very different elements appear in the temples. And the last question that arises of this crowdsourced architecture is exclusiveness. The thing is that these churches were built by parish communities very much against the communists. So if you paraphrase that, it means against the other half of the Polish people who had different views of the world. And you can even read it from the facade that it's very much a defensive structure. I actually see it as a big problem of community-based architecture in general, that communities that are based on neighborhood, they are very often very exclusive, and it's difficult to actually make an inclusive space into that. So the last part of my presentation, I will show you a prototype that my team built in Ukraine. We took these and other questions with us, and we tried to build something very, very small, which would nevertheless include all the lessons, become some sort of a, let's say, a test run of the model that I'm trying to develop. So it was built in the city of Dnipro, in Ukraine. I was invited by a local NGO. That means an NGO that already had an audience. They were organizing festivals of culture and art in Dnipro, and they wanted to build something. They wanted to go to another level, not only organize festivals, but actually create a space for the people in the city. And they were given by the city of Dnipro, they were given a site. This is the very center of the city, the park where the city actually started, and there is a Potemkin's palace with these kind of three Baroque axes, and on one of these axes there is a site that was extremely bad condition, and in the 1930s it was a place of an amphitheater, Stalin's amphitheater, that was destroyed during the Second World War. So what was the first thing to do? The first thing to do was to build an audience. This is the model that I was showing you before. I decided to make it differently, actually create two audiences. First would be a local audience of the future users, and the other would be the network of experts that would help. So the idea was that on the one hand there will be people who will be using this, and we will use them to understand what they need and what kind of place they would like to spend time in. We didn't have any brief, it was just an idea to build something. And on the other hand, we wanted to use my network of architecture friends to simply deliver some sort of qualities that would be difficult to get if they would be working alone. So the first thing to do was to create a brief, actually. What are we building? So we used crowdsourcing to we asked simply every person that would be interested. We had this audience of maybe 3,000 people, what they would like to do there. So name 25 things that you would like to do, and then there was a process of grouping these things and coming from very specific requests to architectural qualities. So instead of like, I want to go there and sit and meet my friends, we were trying to convert this to very, let's say, more abstract architectural qualities, and we created a name, a stage, and a motto, a space where anyone can create their own event. The thing was that out of all these thousands of answers that we got, very many were about performing. So it appeared that within the audience that we had, there was an audience of poets, of musicians, of people that draw, of people that go together, get naked and draw each other, people who, I don't know, read books out loud, a lot of people who do very different things, but what was connecting them is that they wanted to perform. And there was no space for them in the city because of two reasons. The first reason was that all these communities or audiences were quite small. It was like 50 people. And everything that was built in the Soviet times in Dnipro was huge. It was like for 5,000 people. And the second thing is that these spaces were not possible to use because of administrative problems. There was no key. Nobody knew who was responsible for that. So they were never using the official spaces. They needed something that is like simple and ready to use. So the second step, after having, let's say, the brief, it was collective design, and the idea was to use this expertise that we had in order to create something together and see how this collective design works. And there were, let's say, two ways of working inside. The first one was, I would call it modularity. So for example, there was this idea that there would be an acoustic tube inside that would mechanically amplify the sound, very much like the loudspeaker. And there was a computational architect that designed this. There was another module which was like, there was a lot of modules with greenery, and we used the local expert from the local botanic garden and the expert from Poland, the landscape architect, and they decided what kind of plants to use. I was always urging them to give some sort of a new value to the space. So, for example, there was this idea that all of the plants would smell nicely, and some of them would attract butterflies. So things that let's say, without an expert, you would not be able to create. On the other hand, there was the idea of editing. So first modules, but then editing. We had a geometrist in our team that was like constantly editing the design and trying to, together with a psychologist, trying to figure out what would be the perfect form in order to actually make crowdfunding possible. But the point is that if you use this kind of technique of editing, this expert doesn't spend that much time. It's just taking their time for 1 hour, for 2 hours, and adding some value to the design. And at the end, we ended up with, there was an architect, of course, the same master builder, Tomasz Świetlik, who put all these things together and was like collecting all the ideas, and we come up with something that is coherent, although there are a lot of ideas, like small ideas that are included into this that come from crowdsourcing. We created this kind of, like, we didn't show this, which I find beautiful, we rather showed this, which I find kitsch. But it worked pretty well with crowdfunding, showing this kind of very simple vision of what it will be and how it will work. And it was realized, I think, more or less like it was designed, maybe even better, because this tube actually moved a little bit because of the physics of how it was created. And there are, like, say, two very important details. The first important detail is the list of people who participated, so you can see who was there, who was doing what. All the list of authors was very meticulously created. And on the other hand, there is the rules of the game. Because of this communal character, this is a very resilient piece of architecture. There were always people taking care of this. If there was a piece of vandalism, like, you know, somebody destroyed something, that there were people coming within 24 hours and fixing it, and there was always somebody taking care of this. But the other side of this is that what we were, or what I was afraid of, is that it would become too close. So one of the rules was that everybody can organize their events. There is one public calendar, there's one person that coordinates this, and everybody can actually add their events there. So during summer of 2017, they created 60 huge events in 2 months, which is in general one per day, quite a lot. And they were very different. What I find a big success is that I wouldn't go to many of them. I mean, what I really dislike about spaces like this is many times they are dominated by one, let's say, religion, let's say the hipster place, or the place of Orthodox Christians, or a place of somebody else. And in here it was changing all the time, and the character was very, very different all the time. Also, like the place was nominated for the Mies van der Rohe award because of this communal character, and it got the European Prize for, the special mention, the European Prize for Urban Public Space. So also the professional community kind of liked this way of doing things. And just the last slide. This was a prototype, very small. I hope to repeat this in a bigger scale, and I think there are very important questions. The one is the relation between finance and form. The crowdfunding as we have it now is very primitive. You can just ask one question: do you want to fund it or not? And people either fund it or not. And what could be done, we could build another platform which allows for modularity and funding different elements, and like building growing in an uncoordinated way. The other thing is forms of collective property, so this is also something I will look at. In here it was simple, it was all NGO and it was all communal, but maybe it can be more complicated. New software, there's absolutely no software to design anything together. We were using the software for the film industry, because they are already doing things together, and like we will simply using their software, which is not very well adjusted for architectural work, but it worked well for us. And I think that another thing is reclaiming the term developer. What this project showed is that the pre-work is much more important than the actual architectural work, and let's say reclaiming the term the developer is something that has very bad reputation today. I think that reclaiming this term and giving some good reputation to a developer is also something good to do. So this is to say the future trajectory. Thank you.
So thanks, Kuba, and I'll moderate the discussion. So if you have any questions, please go for it.
It's a brilliant response. Thank you for sharing. I'm just wondering, when you presented the history of the church architecture in Poland, there's a very sort of specific set of circumstances that enable that to happen on such a massive scale. I wondered what your thoughts are on the situation that we are in now, maybe in Ukraine, where you're working, or in the wider world, where what is the circumstances that you think might propel such endeavor in the future?
That's a good question, thank you. Well, in Ukraine it was easier because it was just after the revolution and there was a huge wave of mobilization that I'm still part of because I'm building a school in Ukraine right now that is still part of this energy after the Maidan revolution. I think that in general, the question that you're asking is how do you mobilize people to take part in this? And I consider it a technical problem. I think that there are very many emotions that can be worked upon in here. Like for example, the fact that many people want to participate in shaping the cities. And I think that the forms of participation that we have right now, I think they're flawed. Like I'm looking at Poland, like all these participatory budgets where you don't really, it's a little bit like Nike campaign, you know? They are designing the shoe and then they are letting you to choose the color of the sticker on it. And this is more or less how these participatory techniques work. I think that this is the one that potentially, if it's done correctly, and if I will be able to design this process correctly, it can use this energy. Another thing is that I have a feeling that there are many people who want to do something with their hands. This is something that I noticed in Moscow when I lived there. There's like a lot of managers and people who work with PowerPoint presentations, and they want to do something. You know, they go to the pottery classes and they want to do something. I think that I didn't show anything from the construction. There was also this moment when we were dividing the tasks, what will be done by professionals and what will be done by the people. It appeared that people want to come and to participate in something and build something together, and they're extremely precise. Of course, you cannot give dangerous tasks to unprepared people, but you can, for example, give them precision tasks, like making this tube that was a very difficult geometry. People would cut out the elements and would do it really, really well. So I think that there are certain things where you can actually mobilize people. And the third thing, which I think is very, very nice, is that like I noticed that more and more we are working from home or separately from the workspace, and people need these spaces where to meet. So I even went to a contemporary church construction in Poland. Poland is not that Catholic anymore, but still a possibility to do something together in this kind of picnic style and participate, do something. It's still something that people find attractive and would join. So I think that it has to be worked on, but there are certain motivations or certain emotions that can be harnessed.
I wanted to jump actually on this question of scale because I wanted to ask something similar, but also add, because you talked a lot about this idea of solidarity, which is also, but not only, but also a very strongly present Catholic religious concept. And it is not a case, perhaps, therefore, that you drew on all these examples there are churches. So this idea of crowdsourcing, to me, from the presentation, which was very interesting, by the way, thank you, I forgot to say that at the beginning, is very much interlinked with this idea of a religious community, rather than a more heterogeneous and broader community. So I'm wondering, how did you think about not just scaling up in terms of in a quantity sense, but also in terms of social difference? How do you think about scaling up this idea or these methods of crowdsourcing for non-religious building, but also buildings that are not just a small building in a town, which is, in terms of numbers, is easier to manage, a town which is probably not as heterogeneous as a city like London, let's say. So how do you, have you thought about this idea of scaling both in quantity and quality?
So starting with religion, I want to say that I believe that religion is going away. If we look at the data of the Catholic Church in Poland, there is a stable decline of amount of people who go to the Mass. This stable decline started in 1980, and it's extremely stable. It's very funny to look at this because there were a lot of political events that could have changed it, like the end of communism, entering the European Union, but actually it's very stable. It's actually following the line of urbanization only after 30 years. But the collectivity and collective action will not go anywhere. It was, I believe it was there before Catholic Church came, and it's still there. People still do it. In Ukraine, church is not that strong, and it was still possible to do it. I think these are separate things. But then, if you ask about, like, I'm asking myself the question: in what kinds of architecture is this possible? I can see very many potential projects that are already appearing. So I was proposed to make a crowdsourced cultural center, and I was proposed to make a crowdsourced library. So these are things that are kind of similar because they have a community of users. It's not based on geography, it's not based on, let's say, the neighborhood that ends here and 500 meters from the... It's more based on affinity and whatever you do and what you're interested in, but it's still some sort of a group of people that has a common interest. And I think that what this project proved is that if you have, for example, a library is a very good example. This is something that I believe should be built by the state, but it's not. And there are very many places where people need this. And let's say building a program of this library, building it's something that's very modular, that allows you to curate what kind of books there are. This is something that allows you to bring in experts. This is something that allows you to, let's say, crowdfund a book and crowdfund a shelf and a bigger shelf and then really like make it a very modular kind of project. This is something where it can work. It's not only the church. So I'm looking at all these typologies where small cultural centers of different kinds that before would be funded and built by the state and are not anymore.
Any other questions?
I found it very interesting how you described in the beginning of very two different processes. And I might have understood it wrong, so correct me if I say something that is not accurate. So basically you were showing us how the state was building the houses for the people using industrial design mostly, and they were having these very particular typologies on what their houses would be. But then the people themselves would just go out and help the church build the churches that had a very different architectural aesthetic in their design. So what would you say is a connecting point between these two processes that in a way, I think it's related to crowdsourcing as well, although it might be my assumption.
I think that there are two connecting points. The one is on the level of the users of the architecture and the other is on the level of architects. On the level of users, I think everybody who was building these churches told us that they wanted something unique, that they were fed up with this generic architecture. That's it. They didn't want to live in this landscape that's like totally the same, and they wanted to have a unique place that is more or less connected with let's say, the ancient culture of Poland. As you saw on the pictures, these churches were not that strongly connected, but still, with the brickwork and stonework, they did remind of some sort of Catholic roots. On the other hand, the architects that we talked with, they were frustrated. So this is the paradox in here, that actually by giving away the power over the project, the architect was getting the power to build. Because in this state system, the architect didn't really have much design. He had a fantastic power over the space, but didn't really design much, and it was just production of generic boxes. And in this crowdsourcing, it was possible to design something. Very quickly it appeared on the construction sites that the architect was losing this power because of the way how it was built, that everything went wrong. But on the other hand, like if you control this process and if you understand like how it works, these architects that understood this, and also our project showed this, that the really nice thing about this crowdsourcing is that you don't know what's going to come out of this. It's like you're starting somewhere and you don't know. Like I think that the project, like this project that I showed you, is very, very small. But one thing that you can tell about this is it's quite original. I haven't seen a form similar to this one, and also a space that does things like this similar to this one, because it's very, very strongly based on local capacity.
architecture in Europe, and now that we're in this sort of zeitgeist, is it still post-socialist? Is it still post-con? Like, how long can we keep thinking of that and sort of finding itself in that middle ground of shifting from one thing to another? Why do you think that there's, in that particular context, an appetite for this, or what do you foresee to be the most kind of successful, maybe, outcomes of this process, or maybe some barriers based on the context? If you have any thoughts on that.
I don't know. I mean, like, I know that, for example, as you notice, I'm not using really the term Central Europe. For me, Eastern Europe is east from Oder River, and this is a space where I understand what's going on in society, and west from this is Western Europe, where I'm kind of clueless. I don't know. I think that the interesting thing is that socialism collapsed in 1991, between 89 and 91. But there is still no new thing that came. I think that the last 20, 30 years, it was the time when we were trying to copy what's going on in the West very much, and now nobody wants this anymore, and there is still a search of how should we build things, and there is a very interesting discussion, especially in Ukraine, which is building the nation state right now. Poland built the nation state 100 years ago exactly, and Ukraine is doing it now. So there's a huge discussion, what do we take with us? And different countries give different answers. The Russians, they take much more from the socialist past than the Polish and Ukrainians, but still the Ukrainians do, although there is war going on, although there is hostility, they still try to reevaluate this past without being too biased about it. So I think that what's going on right now is the process where we're trying to find a new identity after communism collapsed, and after also this project of copying the West. It didn't really work, I think. So I don't know, it's exciting. I think it's a really exciting moment, especially that it's also correlated with a very weird architectural situation where Eastern Europe is the only region in the world that's losing population. So you don't actually need to build much, or you need to build much less than in other places. So I think it's a very curious condition.
Any other question? Well, not. I'll ask the last one. I mean, you presented, and I know it's not true, but you, like, from the presentation, one could think that this project and process always goes very smoothly, and everyone always has good intentions, right? Whereas this kind of opening of the process, of course, makes it vulnerable to someone trying to hijack it, to someone trying to take it over, to someone trying to destroy it by way of participating. And just the normal everyday conflict, because whenever you have a big group of people and high stakes in terms of vision and ideas, there must be inevitably conflict. So if you could reveal more of this side too.
Well, first of all, I must say that this is less of a problem than the inclusiveness. I think that, like, how to omit this problem that you were talking about. Just take with you the people that want to participate, right? You try to mobilize your audience, build your audience around an idea, and then there are people who want to participate. And then if you don't have the people that are in general negative, like it's an easy path, right? Because if you're talking about participation in an urban area, everybody has to be on board, and then there's a lot of people who are simply against building anything. So in here it's a bit easier. What's a real problem is what do you do so that it's open for all these other people after it's built. And this is something that I think we succeeded to do in stage, but it's not sure. I'm not sure if it would be successful in any other circumstances. In here, it simply worked, but I'm not sure why. So I believe that participation is very much a technical problem. Like, how do you communicate things? How much time do you give to certain tasks? How do you moderate this, etc.? And it's possible to make it really, really smooth, but I would say that the real problem is that if in the beginning you choose with whom you are going to work, and you take some people on board with you, how do you do it and then open it up for others? This is something that I cannot really answer yet, and this is something that I see as the biggest problem.
Okay, Thank you. Anyone else? Just final questions? Oh, this one.
It's a very, very pragmatic question, and I might have missed it, but this last project that we're looking at, I'm wondering who owns the land, the site, and on that basis, what the process was by which you convinced the owner, whether that's the municipality or the state or a private owner, how you convinced them without a clear vision at the beginning of the process, right? Because often as architects, what we do is we put together concept documents on behalf of a client and present those to a stakeholder, and either they check a box or they don't.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how you presented the vision for, well, we're going to design it once we have permission to do something here.
Well, it was built on the land that belongs to the city, the municipality, and the NGO was given permission to build an installation without foundations for 1 year of time in here. So it didn't have foundations. It's an installation.
So it's technically a temporary.
It's a temporary thing. So what you're asking, this is a question that I'm like looking forward to be challenged by in the next project. And here, let's say this question was eliminated from the process.
Cool. Thanks.
Good. Well, thank you very much for coming, and yeah, have a
See you
good day.
next week.